I want to start with the moment when internal dissent stops being background noise and starts behaving like evidence. Because political parties argue all the time. That's normal. What is not normal is when disagreement inside a party becomes organized, procedural, and public in ways that threaten the authority of its own leader. That is the threshold we are now crossing. The breaking point is not a single quote or a dramatic confrontation. It is a pattern. It shows up in votes that don't go the way they are supposed to. It shows up in fundraising decisions that quietly shift away from the center of gravity. It shows up in Republican lawmakers, donors, and officials doing something that for nearly a decade they have been structurally disincentivized from doing, saying no to Donald Trump, and meaning it. For years, the Republican Party functioned on a simple enforcement mechanism. Loyalty was rewarded. Dissent was punished. Primary challenges were not theoretical, they were deployed. Careers ended quickly. The lesson was learned early and reinforced often. Even lawmakers who disagreed privately adapted publicly because the cost of defiance was clear and immediate. What makes this moment different is that the cost-benefit calculation appears to be changing. We are seeing Republicans who are no longer acting as though Trump is the unavoidable center of the party's future. That shift doesn't require a majority to be meaningful. It requires only enough people in enough strategic positions to stop absorbing risk on his behalf. This is how revolts begin in institutions. Not with speeches, but with withheld compliance, with procedural resistance. People are deciding that the danger of continued alignment has finally exceeded the danger of breaking ranks. That calculation is never ideological first. It is structural. It happens when legal exposure grows, when electoral math tightens, when donor patience thins, and when institutions sense that protection is no longer guaranteed. The important thing to understand here is that this is not about whether Donald Trump has support. He does. It is about whether he still has control. And those are not the same thing. When power begins to leak inside a party, it does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself in moments where obedience used to be automatic, and suddenly it isn't. To understand why the current revolt matters, you have to understand how thoroughly loyalty to Donald Trump was constructed inside the Republican Party in the first place. This was not a cultural accident or a spontaneous mass movement that simply overtook the party. It was built deliberately, over time, through mechanisms of power that rewarded obedience and made dissent structurally dangerous. After 2016, Trump did something unusual in modern American politics. He did not merely lead a party, he reorganized it around himself. The Republican National Committee, once an institutional counterweight to any individual nominee, was transformed into an extension of the president's political operation. Fundraising lists merged. Messaging aligned. Party infrastructure increasingly existed to protect one figure rather than to manage a coalition. Primary elections became the enforcement tool. Republicans who broke with Trump learned quickly that ideological conservatism or long service offered no protection. What mattered was personal alignment. Candidates endorsed by Trump were elevated regardless of experience. Those who weren't were framed as traitors to the base. The result was not just fear, but adaptation. Lawmakers recalibrated their public behavior to avoid becoming targets. Media ecosystems reinforced the system. Conservative outlets that once balanced party loyalty with institutional skepticism shifted toward personality-driven coverage. Loyalty was normalized as authenticity. Criticism was framed as betrayal. Over time, this created an informational environment in which dissent inside the party was not merely unpopular, but illegible. This structure held through scandals, impeachments, electoral losses, and legal investigations because it offered something powerful in return: protection. Trump's dominance insulated Republicans from accountability by redirecting attention, mobilizing voters, and punishing external critics. For many office holders, loyalty was not belief, it was insurance. But systems built on fear have a flaw. They require constant proof of strength. They depend on the assumption that retaliation will always be worse than resistance. When that assumption weakens, when primaries stop being fatal, when donors stop enforcing discipline, when institutions stop coordinating around a single figure, loyalty stops being automatic. That's the condition we're entering now, not because Trump suddenly changed, but because the structure that sustained him is under strain. And once loyalty is revealed as a transaction rather than a conviction, it becomes renegotiable. When loyalty inside a political party begins to loosen, the pressure doesn't first show up in speeches or headlines. It shows up inside institutions in the places designed to translate loyalty into action. Congress, party committees, courts, donor networks. These are not ideological spaces. They are procedural ones. And they are now under stress. For years, Republican institutions acted as buffers for Donald Trump. They absorbed shocks that, under normal circumstances, would have forced a reckoning. Impeachments were neutralized through party line votes. Oversight was constrained by leadership decisions, norms bent without breaking because the institutional cost of enforcement was judged to be higher than the cost of accommodation. That calculation is changing. In Congress, we see it in moments when party discipline no longer guarantees outcomes. Votes that once would have been locked down now require negotiation. Leadership positions become unstable. Procedural tools, delays, abstentions, refusals to endorse start appearing where automatic compliance used to exist. These are not acts of rebellion for their own sake. They are signs of institutional actors protecting themselves against future liability. The donor class reflects the same stress. Large contributors are not driven by ideology alone. They are driven by viability. When legal exposure grows, when electoral prospects narrow, donors reassess risk, funding slows, conditions are attached, alternatives are quietly explored. This is not a moral judgment, it is institutional survival. The courts represent another fault line. Trump's influence over judicial appointments reshaped the legal landscape, but courts are not political shields. As cases move forward through established procedures, party institutions lose the ability to contain consequences. Legal timelines do not respond to loyalty. They respond to evidence. What makes this moment significant is that multiple institutions are experiencing strain simultaneously. No single entity has fully broken away. That's not how institutional stress tests work. Instead, they reveal where structures can no longer carry the weight placed upon them. The Republican Party is discovering that protecting one figure indefinitely requires suppressing too many internal safeguards at once. When those safeguards begin to reactivate even partially, the system starts pushing back. Not out of principle, but out of necessity. This is the moment when a political movement stops being tested by its opponents and starts being tested by its own architecture. When institutional pressure builds long enough, it doesn't release evenly. It finds existing weaknesses and widens them. Inside the Republican Party, those weaknesses were never ideological abstractions. They were practical disagreements that had been temporarily suppressed in the name of unity. What we are seeing now is not the creation of new divisions, but the reemergence of old ones. One fracture line runs between Republicans who view politics as a constitutional system and those who view it as a vehicle for personal authority. This divide predates Donald Trump, but his rise forced it underground. Lawmakers who once defined conservatism in terms of process separation of powers, rule of law, institutional restraint learned that those principles offered little protection when they conflicted with loyalty to a dominant figure. For years, they adapted. Now, some are reconsidering that bargain. Another division is strategic rather than philosophical. There are Republicans who measure success by electoral outcomes and those who measure it by cultural confrontation. These two groups can coexist when victories feel possible. They cannot when losses accumulate. As elections become harder to win in competitive districts and states, pragmatic Republicans face a narrowing path. Continued alignment with Trump may energize a base, but it also hardens opposition and limits expansion. That tension is no longer theoretical. It shows up in polling, in candidate recruitment, in the kinds of races the party can realistically contest. Foreign policy has become a third fault line. The post-Cold War Republican consensus on alliances, military power, and global engagement has been eroded by a more isolationist, transactional approach. National security Republicans, once a dominant faction, now find themselves navigating a party where skepticism of alliances and admiration for strongman leaders are no longer disqualifying. That shift creates internal conflict, not over values, but over risk. What holds these fracture lines together is not resolution, but delay. For years, Trump's dominance allowed the party to postpone choosing between them. Loyalty acted as glue. As that glue weakens, the underlying structure becomes visible. This is why the current revolt looks uneven and confusing. It is not one rebellion. It is multiple tensions surfacing at once, each driven by different incentives, timelines, and fears. The party is not splitting cleanly in two. It is straining along several seams simultaneously. And when that happens, control becomes harder to maintain, not because anyone planned a revolt, but because the party can no longer pretend it is unified when it is not. Institutional fractures do not become revolts on their own. They require pressure points, decisions that convert long-standing tension into immediate risk. In this case, the pressure did not come from a single dramatic mistake, but from a series of strategic miscalculations that narrowed the Republican Party's room to maneuver. One of those miscalculations was the assumption that legal exposure could be indefinitely absorbed by the party without consequence. For years, investigations were framed as political attacks, and that framing worked until the volume and specificity of cases began to impose procedural costs. Court schedules do not adjust for campaign calendars. Evidence does not respond to messaging discipline. As legal timelines accelerated, they began to compete directly with electoral ones, forcing party leaders to confront conflicts they could no longer defer. Another trigger was electoral math. Trump's influence remained powerful in the primaries, but the general elections tell a different story. Losses that could once be rationalized as anomalies began to look structural. Swing districts hardened. Suburban erosion persisted. State-level candidates found themselves carrying national baggage they did not control. The strategic miscalculation was assuming that base mobilization alone could substitute for coalition growth indefinitely. There was also a failure to recognize how fatigue operates inside institutions. Loyalty demands repetition. Each new controversy requires a fresh defense. Each escalation requires renewed alignment. Over time, the burden shifts from ideological commitment to operational exhaustion. Republican lawmakers and officials were asked not just to support Trump, but to absorb increasing personal, legal, and electoral risk on his behalf with diminishing returns. Perhaps the most consequential miscalculation was the belief that internal dissent could always be suppressed without cost. Primary threats work until they don't. Public shaming works until it stops deterring behavior. When a few high-profile figures resist and survive, the deterrent weakens for everyone else. Resistance becomes thinkable. These triggers did not create opposition out of nowhere. They activated incentives that were already present. They forced individuals and institutions to reassess whether continued alignment protected them or endangered them. At that point, revolt is no longer ideological. It is procedural. It is about minimizing damage, preserving leverage, and regaining control of systems that feel increasingly unmanageable. The shift is subtle, but decisive. Once party actors begin acting to protect themselves rather than a leader, the balance of power changes. When we talk about a party revolt, it's easy to imagine dramatic confrontations, floor fights, public denunciations, formal breaks. That's not usually how it works in American politics. Historically, revolts inside parties are quieter, slower, and far more procedural. They are less about overthrow and more about reassertion. A revolt does not mean a party has turned against its leader. It means the party has stopped organizing itself entirely around that leader's needs. That distinction matters. Support can persist even as control erodes. Endorsements may continue. Voters may remain loyal. But the machinery, the committees, the funding decisions, the strategic priorities begins to operate with a different center of gravity. We've seen this before. Parties tolerate dominant figures as long as they deliver protection, coherence, and a path to power. When those conditions weaken, parties adapt. Sometimes they do it consciously, through leadership changes and rule adjustments. More often, they do it indirectly, by reallocating resources, elevating alternatives, and allowing internal competition that was previously suppressed. What's important here is that revolts are not moral judgments. They are risk assessments. Institutions exist to survive. When attachment to a single figure begins to threaten that survival, institutions respond by redistributing authority. That process can look chaotic because it lacks a single command center, but it follows a logic. A party revolt also does not guarantee transformation. Parties can fracture, realign, or retrench. Some revolts fail. Others succeed quietly. What they all share is a redefinition of limits. The leader discovers that demands are negotiable. That enforcement is inconsistent. That compliance must be earned rather than assumed. For Donald Trump, the implication is not immediate removal or irrelevance. It is something more consequential, a loss of inevitability. When inevitability disappears, leverage follows. Allies hedge. Rivals emerge. Institutions stop bending automatically. For the Republican Party, the revolt represents an attempt to regain agency, to reassert that the party is an organization with interests distinct from any one individual. Whether that effort succeeds depends on how durable the shift becomes. The deeper lesson is that parties reveal their values not in moments of unity, but in moments of resistance. A revolt shows where power actually resides and where it no longer does. The most important consequence of a party revolt is not what it means for one political figure or even for one political party. It's what it reveals about how democratic systems signal distress and how they attempt to correct themselves. American democracy is built on institutions that are meant to restrain power without requiring collapse. Parties are part of that system. They are not just vehicles for ambition. They are filters, enforcement mechanisms, and early warning systems. When a party begins to resist its own leader, it is often because other forms of accountability have already been exhausted or deferred. What we are witnessing is not a sudden rediscovery of principle. It is a delayed reaction to accumulated strain. For years, safeguards held barely. Norms were stretched, procedures were reinterpreted. Institutions absorbed pressure rather than releasing it. A party revolt is what happens when absorption is no longer possible. The democratic significance lies in the method, not the drama. This is not democracy defending itself through mass protest or constitutional crisis. It is democracy responding through internal recalibration, through donors adjusting support, through lawmakers reclaiming procedural authority, through institutions rediscovering that loyalty to process matters more than loyalty to personality. That process is imperfect and uneven by design. It does not guarantee renewal. It does not ensure accountability. But it does demonstrate that democratic systems have multiple layers of response, and that breakdown is not always loud. There is also a warning embedded here. When accountability is postponed too long, correction becomes more destabilizing. Parties that suppress internal dissent in the name of unity do not eliminate conflict, they store it. When it finally surfaces, it does so under worse conditions, with fewer options and higher stakes. The lesson is not about Donald Trump alone. It is about how democracies test the limits of tolerance for concentrated power. A party revolt is not a triumph. It is a repair attempt. Whether it succeeds depends on whether institutions follow through, whether restraint becomes habitual again, whether rules are enforced consistently, and whether parties remember that their role is to mediate power, not surrender it. Democracy rarely announces its turning points in advance. More often, it reveals them quietly, in moments when obedience stops being automatic and responsibility returns slowly to the system that was designed to carry it.